The Lindbergh Kidnapping was the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh Jr., Charles Lindbergh Sr.'s son. Charles Lindbergh Sr. was the first man to cross the Atlantic Ocean on his own. This made him a global hero and gave him a lot of fame and fortune. He was well known by just about everyone, and that's probably why he was the target of this kidnapping. On March 1st, 1932, at 9 o'clock at night, a makeshift ladder was set up against the Lindbergh residence. About an hour later, the maid visited Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s room to find an empty cradle. As soon as possible, the police were at the Lindbergh residence, searching for clues and for the baby and for the kidnappers. By the time daylight had occurred, the evidence that was discovered was a broken ladder, a chisel, and 2 footprints. The footprints were never measured, and that was a very bad choice. They could have been perfect evidence and helped find the correct criminal. A ransom note was discovered detailing the request for $50,000 for the safe return of the baby, and that they would be in contact very shortly to discuss business further. A few days after the event, a note was mailed to the Lindbergh residence ensuring the safety of the Lindbergh's child. Considering Charles Lindbergh was a very famous man, word spread very quickly about the kidnapping of his son. A man by the name of Dr. John Condon, a 72-year-old retired principal with an overbearing personality, put out a letter in the newspaper offering to be a middleman between the criminals and the Lindberghs.
Baby will be returned, I hope, in a short time. We are in contact and nobody is giving up.
The kidnappers mailed for Condon to receive the money from the Lindberghs and wait for further instruction. The next letters afterward sent Condon to a hot dog stand to find another note which led him to the cemetery. Condon did not have the money, but he decided to meet with them anyway. He discussed information with them, and the criminal, who titled himself as John, panicked and asked what would happen to him if the baby was dead. Condon began badgering with questions to see if the baby was dead, because that would change everything. But John reassured Mr. Condon that the baby was alive. John confessed that the baby was on a boat and that he was safe there. And he would send a token of him being alive later. That token was the baby's outfit that he wore on the day of the kidnapping. Mr. Lindbergh began to worry the kidnappers were becoming impatient. He decided the ransom needed to be compiled as soon as possible. The ransom was going to be paid in marked gold notes. America was transferring off of the gold standard at the time, so it would be easier to target where the criminal was living, the difference in currency. Condon and Lindbergh went to another cemetery. Lindbergh stayed out of sight as to not scare off the criminal, and Condon conversed with them because he had already met them before. John, as he still called himself, traded the envelope that was supposed to tell them where the baby was for the ransom money. The envelope that Lindbergh was given stated that the baby was on a boat on the Atlantic called Nellie. They searched and searched for this boat, but they never found it, and they essentially gave up. Eventually, a truck driver, he was driving along the road very close to the Lindbergh residence, and he found a dead baby. That baby was identified as the Lindbergh's child. The child was presumably killed by a blow to the head, which more than likely was caused by falling off of the ladder, which broke on the night of the kidnapping. The next step in the case was finding the criminals that caused this terrible murder. It was assumed that there was more than one of them because it was a pretty complex plan, and it took a lot of work and a lot of different pieces coming together. And their only way to find the criminals now was to track the gold notes. The gold notes started spread out all over New York, but eventually they began to centralize around the Manhattan and a German part of town called Yorkville. The man known as John was paying for something at a gas station with one of the gold notes when he was caught, and because he was awkwardly making conversation, and his license plate was written down and he was tracked. The man that they believed was John was Richard Hauptmann. He was a carpenter from the Bronx. He had a wife, a kid, the sick kid. And when they searched Hauptmann's house, they discovered $15,000 of the ransom money. Hauptmann's story was that Isidor Fisch, a German friend of his, had given him a lot of his personal belongings to hold on to when he went over to Europe. Over in Europe, Isidor died of tuberculosis. And afterwards, Hauptmann had looked through his stuff and noticed that he had a lot of money. He spent the money on some simple things like gas and rent and stuff like that. Things a normal man would spend his money on, honestly. As soon as the money was found inside of Hauptmann's house, he was basically convicted. The police decided that he was already the person that had committed the crime, and they were just going to try to bend the evidence to make him the person that committed the crime. They decided that he was guilty basically as soon as they found the money. It was just a matter of getting the evidence to show what they already knew. The entire court was pointing to Hauptmann being guilty.
Hauptmann drove into my station and pulled up to an apple pump and asked for 5 gallons of gas.
I identified Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
I identified Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
Bruno Richard Hauptmann was a man who came to the Sheraton Theater and handed me one of the $5 ransom.
All Hauptmann had going for himself was he was trying to get off by being ignorant, because he was trying to state that he didn't know that the money he was using was ransom money, and therefore he wasn't guilty of anything. All of the other evidence pointing towards him he had no rebuttal for, because he stated that he didn't even know a crime has occurred. The case against Hauptmann was one of the biggest in the century. It was the biggest in the century up to this point. This case was taken directly to the Supreme Court, and the prosecutor of Hauptmann strongly pushed for the death penalty with his opening statement. Each witness that came up for the prosecution made the case even stronger against Hauptmann. Wood experts decided that the wood matched wood ripped from Hauptmann's attic. A note with Condon's number was found in Hauptmann's closet. Also, there were matching writing samples. On February 13th, 1935, Hauptmann was convicted as guilty. Eventually, he ran out of appeals and attempts, and he was sentenced to the electric chair on April 3rd, 1936. Considering all of the evidence that was used against Hauptmann to convict him, there's actually a lot of evidence that we've discovered as of now that would prove his innocence. For example, the child that was discovered a mile from the Lindbergh estate was identified simply because of the number of teeth it had. It had been composed to the point where the family doctor could not identify the child. There was a defense handwriting expert that believed that the original handwriting had been tampered with by the police. She was dismissed from the case and not allowed to testify. A witness accused Hauptmann of being near the Lindbergh house previous to the kidnapping. That same witness applied for welfare a couple months later on the grounds that he was almost totally blind, meaning he couldn't identify anyone really if he was totally blind. When John Condon was initially asked if he could identify Hauptmann as the man he had met with in the cemetery, he could not identify him, and he told the police that he could not identify him. He only identified him as the man that was in the cemetery until a couple weeks before the trial, which leads people to believe that he was threatened or bribed or somehow influenced by the police force. When Charles Lindbergh himself testified, he only could testify on Hauptmann's voice, and the only time he heard his voice was when he said 2 words, which were, "Hey doctor." And that was 2.5 years previous to when he testified.